Welcome. My name is George Perkovich. I'm a Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's my pleasure to basically welcome you to this session that we're honored to have today, which is going to be looking at the historical development since 20 years ago, December 13th, the U.S. withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We're going to be led in this discussion by the new president of the Carnegie Endowment, Justice Tino Cuéllar, who, though he was most recently a Supreme Court justice in the state of California, prior to that was a director of the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, which among its other functions does cutting edge research and other work related to nuclear weapons related issues. And in that capacity, worked with Dr. Siegfried Hecker from the Los Alamos lab and developing programming with the Stanton Foundation. So he's actually quite versed in nuclear policy and therefore eager to, as one of his first public outings as the new president of Carnegie, to address this topic and lead us through a discussion with the Honorable Steve Hadley and the Honorable Rose Gottemoeller. So I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to Justice Cuéllar. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's my pleasure as president of the Carnegie Endowment to host this event and to moderate this event. We are very lucky to have two giants in the field, Steve Hadley, former national security advisor, and Rose Gottemoeller, one of the most storied nuclear negotiators in the history of the U.S., if I might say. Both people I've had a chance to work with in the past, and I'm really grateful that you have come. Just to give a little bit of context, for our audience, it's not unusual to find us engaged deeply with nuclear issues. When I had a chance to work with Sig Hecker and Scott Sagan and others at Stanford on these issues, it struck me that the difficulties in ultimately facing up to the nuclear risks and threats in the world had to do not only with geopolitics, with the need to be practical as well as principled, but also that these issues were heavily technological, extremely complex, utterly sometimes far away from public perception or scrutiny. And they depend, as much as any issue affecting global peace and security, on the good judgment, insight, perspective of senior policymakers, not only in the US, of course, who ideally will steer us through a period of great risk and do so in a way that protects the concerns and interests of the American people, for example, but also bears in mind that we would like to live in a world where every generation hands off to the next generation a world a bit safer than it is today. With that as backdrop, I would note that as a lawyer who's taught international law for years, the ABM Treaty is a very interesting treaty. It's an example of how countries come together and come to understand that their needs for security sometimes might take them in directions that they may not have expected at first. For 30 years, that treaty was in force from 1972 to 2002. And as some of you in our audience know, that treaty limited anti-ballistic missile systems that could be used against ballistic missile delivered nuclear weapons. It was negotiated as part of the strategic arms limitation talks. It was hailed at the time by both the US and the Soviet Union as, quote, a substantial factor in curbing the race in strategic offensive arms. But 20 years ago, the US withdrew from this treaty. It did so after consideration of a variety of factors that might affect American security. And our goal today is really twofold. It's to understand that context. Why did that happen? What was driving US policy at that moment? Second, how did that affect the world? What lessons might we draw? How might that inform our own ability to navigate the continuing dilemmas of nuclear security affecting the world? So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our guests and ask them to give some context from their perspective. Steve Hadley was there at the time that the discussion and the decision was made. He'll give us the context from his perspective, the insights of what was driving U.S. concerns at the time. Then we'll hear from Rose Gottemoeller, who was in Moscow at the time and had the chance to observe up close the Russian-Soviet reaction. We'll ask a few questions then about how the world might have been different if the U.S. had done something distinct from what actually occurred. And then eventually we'll get to some of your questions in the audience. So with that, Steve, Rose, welcome. Thank you for working with Carnegie in the past. Thank you for working with us now. And Steve, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. And Tino, congratulations on your assuming the leadership of the Carnegie Endowment. It's a wonderful opportunity for the endowment. They're lucky to have you. Let me provide a little context. The Bush administration got out of the ABM Treaty, as you say, because even though it was directed at ABM systems to counter strategic ballistic missiles, it constrained our ability to develop defenses against theater or tactical ballistic missiles from what we used to call rogue states, countries like Iran and North Korea. These states were developing nuclear weapons that could be delivered by those ballistic missiles. And ballistic missile defense was viewed as a hedge in the event that diplomatic efforts to constrain or eliminate those nuclear and missile programs failed. Those efforts did fail, leaving us with traditional deterrence or threat of retaliation and missile defenses, so-called ability to deny, as tools to manage the threat posed by these states, the United States and its friends and allies. In retrospect, I would argue it was good we got out of the ABM Treaty and were able to develop those tools. But let me provide a little context for that decision. First, there were efforts over almost 2 decades within the U.S. strategic community to find a way to develop ballistic missile defenses against theater and tactical ballistic missiles, even within the terms of the ABM Treaty. This was the very famous broad versus narrow interpretation of the treaty. We failed to achieve a consensus. There was really a partisan split. Democrats argued it could be done. Republicans argued that it could not. Second of all, there were efforts over 3 administrations, Bush 41, Clinton, and Bush 43, before getting out of the ABM Treaty, to develop ballistic missile defenses cooperatively with first the Soviet Union and then with Russia under agreed interpretations or modifications of the treaty that would be agreed by both sides and that would permit such joint developments. All 3 efforts failed. Bush wanted the United States and Russia to agree to withdraw from the ABM Treaty together. Putin refused, but he agreed to offer only a moderate response, and he did. He said he disagreed with the decision, but the U.S. withdrawal was not a threat to Russia's security. Critics claimed at the time that this was a huge mistake, that it undermined strategic stability, and it made further reductions in offensive nuclear forces impossible. Yet 6 months after the announced withdrawal, in December 13th of 2001, when we announced a withdrawal, just in May 24 of 2002, the Moscow Treaty was entered into by the 2 sides, in which they agreed to reduce the number of strategic nuclear warheads to a range of 1,700 to 2,200, significant reductions from the existing START II letter. At the same time, the Moscow Treaty pledged further work on ballistic missile cooperation, and the Bush administration pursued those efforts until the last month in which it was office, and they failed. Over the years, Putin has had buyer's remorse about his acceptance of it, particularly over ballistic missile defense deployments in Europe, and he now argues that they reflect, ballistic missile defense reflects a threat to Russia and a cause for deterioration in our relationship. In parallel with these efforts to develop a cooperative approach to ballistic missile defense with Russia, efforts over 4 administrations tried to eliminate the nuclear armed ballistic missile threat from Iran and North Korea. Again, these were good faith efforts over 4 administrations. We can talk about that. They unfortunately failed. And withdrawal from the ABM Treaty and the development of ballistic missile defenses as a hedge were regrettably, in many ways, became a hedge against and a consequence of the failure of that diplomacy. And I would argue it's good that we had that hedge. That's a view. There are a lot of folks in your audience who will have a different view than the one I've described, but that's really how we see it, how we saw it from the Bush administration.
Thank you, Steve. Just to quickly follow up, those of us who have worked inside executive branch agencies or inside administrations know that the interagency process is often quite thorough, intense, and conveys a great deal of disagreement at times. And I just wonder if at the time you sensed that from that process there were differing voices or perspectives internally before a decision was reached, or whether there's early consensus about this?
Within the Bush administration, it was pretty early consensus. It had been an issue in the run-up to the campaign, and President Bush, then candidate Bush, made clear that addressing the ABM Treaty was something that needed to be done, and that he was committed to moving forward with ballistic missile defense, and that in the Republican view, that would require getting out of the ABM Treaty. So within the administration, there wasn't a whole lot of disagreement. But that, of course, drew on a debate that the country had been having for 20 to 30 years. So it was not that the issue was not debated and the two sides of the argument were not clear. But the Bush administration came in with the president-elect and then president having a firm view about where he wanted to go. And really, there was very little dissent within the administration on that view, is my recollection.
Thank you, Steve. Rose, your perspective of the context of the time, and what was it like to be in Moscow, I gather, as this decision was being taken?
Oh, thank you so much, Tino, and thank you for this great opportunity. It's an honor to be with you, and it's also an honor to be on this podium with Steve Hadley, with whom I've had the privilege of working very well, I would say extensively in the last year on a project for the U.S. Institute of Peace. So thank you, Steve, for your remarks this morning. I can confirm at least one aspect of them, and that is due to the fact that on December 13, 2001, the date when the U.S. notified Russia of its intent to withdraw from the ABM Treaty, I happened to be in Moscow at the Carnegie Moscow Center, not as its director, but on a research trip from Washington. I was slated to have a meeting that day with Marshal Sergeyev, the former chief of the General Staff and commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces. But at the time, he was Putin's senior military advisor in the Kremlin. So when the news broke in the morning in Moscow time, I have to say I panicked slightly. This decision had nothing to do with me. And I would be yet the first American, as far as I knew, to encounter a senior Kremlin official, one who knew the issues inside and out. So the Carnegie driver drove me up to the Kremlin as far as he could go. I had to trudge across that giant, many of you have been there, you know, that giant expanse of like a big courtyard you have to get through to get to the Kremlin Palace. It was snowing and freezing cold. So I trudged up the stairs of the palace and got in through security and got up to the office. And I was surprised when Sergeyev came into the room with his aides and we sat down and started talking about the decision out of Washington. He criticized the U.S. decision, of course, but he generally responded with equanimity. And so I very much want to confirm that initially President Putin and his administration in Moscow agreed to offer only a moderate response. That is exactly what they did at the outset. Also, as Steve said, he has since had buyer's remorse, and we hear about it all the time. But I did want to say at the outset that to me, this, in the end of the day, this was no surprise. It is very much in line with the decision that was made by Andropov at the time that Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program was rolled out in 1983. He had a rather calm reaction at the time, saying that the USSR would not match US missile defense developments in the Star Wars program, but rather would develop better and better methods to ensure ICBM survivability. The countermeasures program associated with their ICBM program that has been so very successful in ensuring ICBM survivability and penetrability over time. On both occasions, the high-level official reactions were rather calm. That is, we can handle this. And the Russians have done so, in my view. But the political discourse, again, Steve is quite right. Putin clearly has had buyer's remorse, not only about this, but about his initial calm reaction, by the way, to the enlargement of NATO. So in these two areas, I see a parallel, and we can discuss that, but that's not the topic of our session today. The political discourse about U.S. withdrawal from the ABM Treaty has become very different. At the negotiating table, and I experienced this personally, we hear again and again about the dire threat of U.S. missile defense technology undermining the effectiveness of Russian strategic offensive forces, that U.S. national missile defenses would be capable of undermining those strategic offensive forces and enabling a successful U.S. first strike against them. It's as if the ghost of Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program continues to roam the halls of the Kremlin and trouble the sleep of Vladimir Putin. Or maybe it's just, and this is an alternative hypothesis well worth considering, it's just a rationale for spending money on strategic forces for political effect on the global stage. To be honest, that is how I have read Putin's rollout of the so-called exotic systems in March of 2018. They have enabled him to proclaim that U.S. missile defenses are no match for these new systems, and therefore Russian strategic offensive forces remain effective under any circumstances. In some ways, I think that's good. It gives him the flexibility to negotiate about further reductions in strategic offensive forces, that is, in the follow-on negotiations to replace New START, without demanding limits on U.S. missile defenses that he knows he can't get. Let's see what happens as preparations for the new negotiations unfold at the strategic stability talks. The working group discussions, I understand, are underway even now. The more important story, in my view, and here is where Steve and my view diverges a bit. The more important story is that the demise of the treaty has actually facilitated a great deal of BMD modernization, yes, in the United States, but also extensively in the Russian Federation. Russia has done extensive work not only to modernize the Moscow ABM system, which would have been allowed by the treaty, but also to build an increasingly long-range and highly capable series of regional missile defense systems. These include the S-300, the S-400, and now the S-500, which is entering into deployment, which has considerable capability against intercontinental ballistic missiles. In effect, the demise of the ABM Treaty freed up the Russians. It permitted them to outrun us and, frankly, NATO in regional air and missile defense, integrated air and missile defense, a problem that I felt acutely while I was at NATO and continue to feel today. So what now? I think that it will be important to make limits on missile defenses a two-sided issue at the strategic stability talks and in the negotiations to replace New START. If the Russians are going to insist our missile defenses should be on the table, then we should insist their modern systems, especially the S-500, be on the table. This is important as they seem minded to sell it abroad and could therefore spur regional missile defense proliferation, the implications of which we do not understand. I'm wondering, for example, if there was any discussion of this. I don't know it for a fact. Some in the audience may, but President Putin was visiting India this week and had meetings with Modi in Delhi. So I wonder if a discussion of the S-500 was on the table. It would be a natural follow-on to their purchase, I suppose, of the S-400 system. But I'm only speculating here. In any event, this is a concern of mine, proliferation of regional missile defenses capable against intercontinental ballistic missiles. So thank you again very much for this opportunity. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Rose. You make a compelling point that one real potential implication of the U.S. change with respect to the treaty and withdrawal from it is proliferation risk of anti-ballistic missile systems. I wonder, though, let me zoom out and think 30,000 feet for a moment and ask this follow-up question. From a game theoretic perspective, if we think about strategy in almost a mathematical sense, the way the RAND Corporation historically did, and so many U.S. policymakers have, the logic of mutually assured destruction that underlies conventional nuclear deterrence is very powerful and well-grounded. But from a psychological, humanist perspective, it's quite disconcerting and somewhat alarming, I guess. And I wonder if that doesn't make it quite understandable in principle that U.S. policymakers wanted some more thorough way to respond to an accidental nuclear launch or a rogue regime of some kind that got its hands on nuclear weapons.
Well, I have to be honest, given the reality of the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, I have come to be at peace with the notion of limited missile defenses. And the U.S., in fact, has put considerable investment in the technologies of more and more effective interceptors. I think, frankly, this is a good insurance policy. It does ensure, as Steve mentioned, that we are able to cope with and deter limited threats from Iran and the DPRK. It also ensures that we have some capability against, as you put it, Timo, an accidental launch. So I think that is good. I think there is, in some strands of the US body politic, an urge to push back toward a more comprehensive national missile defense system with more and more investment in national missile defenses in the continental United States. Here, I worry, and I worry a lot about the implications for US defense expenditure. In the end of the day, the Star Wars program stumbled over the expense of its implementation, as well as the technological challenges. And I think we're in, frankly, no different place today with regard to more extensive national missile defenses in the United States.
Thank you, Steve. Let me pick up this point about technology for a moment. I wonder how contingent ultimately the case for withdrawing from the ABM Treaty was on the extent of technological progress, which is to say, like today, the U.S. anti-ballistic missile defense system, focused, for example, on North Korea, has a track record in testing that is not perfect, certainly, and for its efficacy, we might expect that we'd want one missile fired at a time and, optimal conditions and so on. And so I guess, what would be your reflection on the extent to which the benefits of withdrawal really are contingent on the extent of technological progress?
I think it's an extent of technological progress, but also a change in the mission. So the Star Wars, my recollection is that the Star Wars vision that Ronald Reagan promulgated, as interpreted and applied by the Defense Department, was to use SDI, it was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, to mitigate the leading edge of a Soviet ballistic missile attack. It was an anti-Soviet conception and an effort by Ronald Reagan to sort of say we should not base on our security on threatening to obliterate each other, but we should agree that we will defend against each other's systems. That's a more humane and moral way as a base for deterrence. But after the end of the Cold War, and I want to come back to this, the Bush 41 administration had a different conception of the mission of ballistic missile defense. It was initially, Senator Nunn pushed this very hard at the time, as we called it GPELS, Global Protection Against Limited Strikes. And it was directed against an accidental or unauthorized launch of a Soviet, then Russian strategic system. But increasingly, the focus of the Bush 41 administration was developing capability against emerging capabilities by North Korea and Iran. And on that, it seemed that the United States and Russia had common interests. In fact, Iran and North Korea, who were developing ballistic missiles and, we felt, nuclear weapons, are closer to Russia than they are to the United States. And on Rose's point, yes, there has been a proliferation of ballistic missile defenses, but that's because there's been a proliferation of ballistic missile capabilities. Lots of nations are developing those ballistic missile capabilities, and lots of nations feel vulnerable to them and want defenses as a way to protect themselves against it. And remember, it's not ballistic missile defenses that kill people, it's ballistic missiles that kill people. So I think you had a transition of the mission, and also at the same time, the technologies were coming. So we had capabilities against limited attacks, particularly by tactical and theater ballistic missiles. And if you look and think about what the Israelis have done to develop capabilities against those kinds of missiles, as well as our own, it's a pretty good story. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good story. We should come back later, Tino, to this issue about the Russian and the Chinese threats and what is the role of ballistic missile defense in that. But I think to answer your question, the mission changed, and it became clear that we had a good shot at developing the technologies that were able to deal with that reduced mission. And I think we've done pretty well. Not perfect, but pretty well. And it's been demonstrated in combat situations.
Thank you, Steve. I hear you to be saying in no small measure that while the technical challenges are enormous, even with a more focused mission, we have to bear in mind that if we size the mission in a particular way, we're having a very different technical conversation than if we're dealing with a vision like what Ronald Reagan had in effect.
Exactly right.
Good. And Rose, let me follow up with you on that point. So if you imagine both starting from the point that Steve is making about, let's talk about this in terms of more limited mission, and now imagine, and this is a little bit hypothetical, but maybe not entirely impossible to imagine, particularly for somebody like me who's been sitting in Silicon Valley for so many years, that we have a series of breakthroughs, and maybe they're quantum computing, maybe they're just new ways of using conventional machine learning, maybe it's something about the way we think about sensing that really drastically increases the efficacy of a more limited mission missile defense framework, such that, at least with respect to a regime like North Korea, there's a pretty sizable possibility that 1, 2, 3 missiles could be dealt with fairly effectively. Would that really change your perspective, or would you still think, well, in the grand scheme of things, the degree of destabilization of the equilibrium we were in was still too costly to have thought that was worth abandoning the ABM Treaty for?
Well, again, I support continued improvement in limited missile defense capabilities. So what technology can bring to bear on this problem, I think, is important for us both to pay attention to, but also to do our best to then deploy in our missile defense systems that are focused on Iran and North Korea, et cetera. What concerns me, and I take Steve's point about the proliferation of missile systems around different regions. This is an important thing. What I am questioning a bit, Steve, is your notion that perhaps it's not so bad to have then a proliferation of regional missile defense capability, whether it's Iron Dome-like systems, which the Israelis have developed to great effect. What I worry about is the kind of situation we see in Europe, with the Russians developing extraordinarily capable missiles, offensive missiles of shorter ranges. The Iskander system is a good family of missiles, is a good example, which they are deploying in the heart of Europe, first of all, in Kaliningrad, now increasingly in Crimea as well, at the same time acquiring very capable regional defenses as well, the S-400, S-500, I'll throw the S-300 in there too, all very capable. So it means that the challenge to NATO for both deterring their missile deployments, but also then defending against them is extraordinary. And frankly, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, NATO is trying very hard to get its arms around the problem of integrated air and missile defense now, given the enhancement of the Russian threat to Europe, missile threat to Europe. And in this sense, I think we still need to try to work the offensive side of the problem in terms of limiting offensive missile deployments as well, and then think what value limited missile defense brings. And I am a great proponent of NATO developing its IAMD capabilities in a way it really hasn't invested in a long, long time. So I think we also have to consider what the threats to our allies are and how this improvement in limited missile defense capabilities in the hands of the Russians, and perhaps proliferation of them as they sell them to others. The Chinese are a good example, and I agree we should come to that. What does that mean for our ability to deter and defend also on behalf of our allies?
It's a real
That's
dilemma.
helpful. So
It's
Rose,
a real problem.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I beg your pardon.
Yeah, I was just going to note, I mean, what I take you to be saying, Rose, and maybe this is partly why, Steve, you think it's a real problem, is at a national level, you were acknowledging, Rose, that the perspective of an individual country might be that there's great benefit from some of these technologies if they develop to the right level. The system-wide effects is part of what you're concerned about, the degree of proliferation, the incentives that change, the competitive pressures for developing, more sophisticated ballistic missiles. And that does become harder to see, like, what is the end game there?
And the pressures against our allies expand, and in a way that sometimes it ends up them having to think through and make the investments themselves in how to deter and defend, and of course working together with us. But I know, for example, in the NATO context, that again, getting sufficient capability in place for integrated air and missile defense has been, it's been a steep climb. And of course, we're all encouraging the NATO allies to share their burden of their defense, but it is a difficult situation now, given the very capable Russian missile systems being deployed in the heart of Europe.
Steve, your thoughts about this before we turn to China?
Sure. You have to make a judgment in some sense. Is it ballistic missile defense that is provoking the proliferation of ballistic missiles, or is it ballistic missile proliferation that is provoking the proliferation of ballistic missile defenses? And I think it's the issue here is pretty clear. It is the proliferation of ballistic missiles that is the problem. The intermediate range missiles, for example, that China is using to threaten Taiwan and is in a position to use to threaten Japan and Seoul, they, of course, were never limited. China, because the INF Treaty, which limited intermediate range missiles, only applied to Russia and the United States. So China was under no constraints, and China was proliferating its deployment of intermediate and shorter range ballistic missiles really long before there was much missile defense capability in Japan, Korea, or in the region. And the efforts to help work with the Japanese, with the South Koreans, develop ballistic missile defense capability, I think is clearly in response to what the Chinese are doing. Russia is a harder case, but remember there was an INF treaty that would have limited the deployments in Russia. INF treaty eliminated a whole category of intermediate range systems. Russia was clearly viewed by first the United States and then ultimately by NATO as violating that treaty. And the question is, what do you do when you have a treaty, you're abiding by it, and the other side is not? And finally, the Trump administration decided to get out of the treaty. But again, I would say that the need then to deploy defenses and to get NATO into this game is a result of the proliferation push by the Russians to enhance their missile capability to threaten Europe. And it's a good thing we have those technologies around that offer our NATO allies an opportunity to be able to provide some defense against those systems. So that's how it looks to me. People can disagree, but I think it's the better. I think I've got the better argument.
Well,
could I just add a quick comment here? In many ways, I could not agree more. The only point I'm making is that do we want now to contemplate the notion of a new set of constraints on intermediate range ground launched missile systems? I don't call it a new INF treaty because I don't want anybody to think that I'm promoting a return to the INF treaty as it existed, but perhaps some regional arrangements where I think, frankly, the Chinese may be willing to come to the table because they have some equality of capability here. And they are quite concerned about the advent of the deployment of a new U.S. ground-launched cruise missile in Asia. And they are, although they'll never admit it, I believe they are concerned about the deployment of increasingly effective Russian missiles as well, including the 9M729 missile that was in violation of the INF treaty. So I think it may be possible to draw both Russia and China to the table to talk about some regional INF constraints. And I think that's well worth considering and talking about, rather than just going down the line of thinking only about deployment of missile defenses.
Well, I would agree. And under my narrative, we have always, for almost 30 years, over 3 and 4 administrations, tried to get through negotiations a handle on the threat. And I would certainly think this is the kind of issue that we ought to pursue in the strategic dialogue that the administration has started with Russia, and the kind of strategic dialogue that Jake Sullivan suggested at least even was beginning to be discussed between President Biden and President Xi. So Rose and I are in agreement. Of course, we ought to try to see if we can get some kind of negotiated limits on those things. But I think once again, ballistic missile defense capability is the hedge against the failure of those efforts.
We're going to turn to questions from the audience in just a minute, but let me ask you to, just picking up a little bit on some of the themes in your discussion just now, China, Russia in particular. How might this whole conversation have been different if we do the counterfactual and try to imagine the U.S. never withdrawing from the ABM Treaty, trying to focus what limited activity it did on missile defense within the confines of, the one ABM complex you could have and the limits, the 100, missile limit and all that. How might this conversation be different? Like maybe not different at all, or maybe quite different. What do you think, Rose?
Well, I think, frankly, Steve's right that we had so many efforts over multiple administrations to try to develop, for one thing, cooperation with the Russians. And I think those efforts would have continued with the ABM Treaty still in force. And I refer, for example, to the efforts at one point to even consider using Russian radar systems in regional missile defenses in Eurasia. That would be a cooperative effort between the United States and Russia, and on behalf of, again, defense of the NATO allies. Maybe this was a bad idea, spectacularly bad idea, but I think with the ABM Treaty in place, providing a kind of stable background, perhaps we could have been ambitious in how we thought about cooperating with Russia to better improve the regional missile defenses in Eurasia and perhaps even beyond. And what effect that would have had on the developments in China, I cannot say. It's totally speculative, but I do think it's worth considering. In any event, that's where I see the main issue, is that we really interrupted what had been abortive attempts to cooperate with the Russians, but it interrupted any further efforts to cooperate on this in this area.
Steve?
That's a very interesting point Rose makes, because those efforts to do cooperation with Russia continued quite seriously after we got out of the ABM Treaty under both the Bush and the Obama administrations. As I say, we pursued it. We got President Putin to say, when he was at Kennebunkport, 2007, I think it was, to say that the missile defense cooperation is an area of strategic cooperation between the United States and Russia, and basically opened the door. And we tried to walk through that door. Condi Rice and Bob Gates went to Moscow, sat down with Putin, tried to work out an arrangement. We failed. The Obama administration had their own effort to do cooperation. I had a track 2 effort with some former generals of the United States, Russia, and in Europe. We came up with a framework for cooperation. We gave it to the track 1, said, here it is, this is how you do it. But once again, the politics moved away from us. And that, I think, is the issue on Russia. So if I might, let me just give a little context. Bush administration time, long time ago, Bush 43. Bush is making statements like, we are not threatened by the Soviet, now Russian, nuclear deterrent. We're prepared to reduce our level of strategic nuclear warheads unilaterally if necessary. We don't do the sizing of our nuclear forces looking at the Russian capability. Those statements seem, hard to believe given where we are now. But that was the thinking of the time, and that was the opportunity. But the relationship between the United States and Russia is soured. And I would argue it's soured for a lot of reasons that are much more decisive than missile defense. Things like Russia felt weakness, felt exploited in a lot of ways with their weakness. They renewed their strength, partly because of the price of oil, partly because of some fiscal policies. They had grievances about not being treated appropriately. There was the view that the color revolutions on the border of Russia were an effort by the United States to turn regimes against Russia and dress rehearsal for destabilizing Russia itself. Putin has a long list of grievances. They've become they disagreed what we did in Iraq. They disagreed with what we did in Kosovo. They disagreed with what we did in Libya. Long string of abuses that soured the relationship. And the challenge now, and Tino, I'd like your view. I think it'd be interesting to hear your view and Rose's view now. But we have gone so far in our relations with Russia from where it was in the Bush administration, where we did not consider missile defense as directed against Russian strategic central systems in any way. Maybe given that relationship, we need to think about whether we want, in fact, a capability against Russian strategic nuclear weapons. And increasingly, with things like the SM-3 missile and the deployment of the Aegis ships and the like, we are developing some limited capability. I still think it's not significant, and the Russians can overwhelm it by numbers, if not by technology. But, you really, I think, have a different Russia today. And you have to ask the question about, in terms of ballistic missile defense, do we really want to keep Russian strategic central systems off limits in terms of ballistic missile defense? I don't have an answer. I think it's a very different question than what we face I think under any prior administration, but it's an issue that's front and center, I think, for the Biden administration.
Rose, your thoughts about this?
Well, if we go down that track, given the fact that we have this deterrence relationship, which is related to first strike deterrence, as we call it, and that we sustain our forces at a high level of readiness to launch on warning. If you proceed down the track of saying, well, we also need missile defenses for some defense against this more malign Russia, and I absolutely agree, we're facing a more malign and aggressive Russia. But if you head down that track, then you do head down the track, I think, of what the Russians say they are concerned about is that the United States is on the road of undermining their strategic offensive force structure, and perhaps on the road then to at least dreaming about a capable first strike backed up by missile defenses. So I think there's a destabilization aspect of this that we need to tread very, very cautiously and think ahead very, very long and hard before we would make any major changes of this kind. I continue to hold out the possibility, particularly now, as I said in my own remarks, that with these so-called exotic systems, some of which are already captured by the by the New START treaty, the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, for example, as well as the Sarmat heavy ICBM are captured by the New START treaty. But the other systems, I think, give some flexibility for negotiation on both sides and for considering how, in fact, we will continue together to bolster the stability of our deterrence relationship as we move forward and try to grapple with these other questions. One thing I wanted to add, Tino, was with regard to regional intermediate range constraints. I talked about Asia, but frankly, Putin has put an increasingly interesting offer on the table with regard to the missile intermediate range missile moratorium in Europe. At first, it was horribly one-sided. They essentially were trying to keep the new U.S. ground-launched cruise missile out of Europe and not offering up anything on their side. But a year ago, last October, the Putin proposal was refreshed, as I call it, and Putin started talking about removing the 9M729 out of Europe, placing it east of the Urals, and putting in place a monitoring and verification regime. This is interesting. We shouldn't just, in my view, discard it out of hand, although we must be concerned about Russia and its propaganda tactics, of course. But this is something that could be interesting, particularly as it could increase the interest of the Chinese if increasingly threatening intermediate range systems are appearing in Asia on the Russian side as well. So I think there's all kinds of dynamics here that we need to consider, but I would prefer going down the road of looking for ways to ensure continued stability of offensive forces rather than toying with the notion of upping our missile defense game against Russia.
Two quick comments on that. One is to note that our discussion just now has anticipated some of the questions that came in from the audience and comments. So just I note one issue that people wanted us to touch on was whether there was merit in reviving theater missile defense demarcation agreements, such as those concluded by President Clinton and Yeltsin in the early 90s, which is sort of touched on a little bit. But the other comment I wanted to make, Steve, is you asked in some ways a more precise and focused version of what I was getting at in my initial question to Rose, which is it's sort of like when we deal with these issues, like we were walking very, very close to the very edge of a huge chasm of the Grand Canyon. And we have any number of reasons to think that we're not, 1 or 2 inches away from precipice, but we're not far from it. And that probably is sobering to any of us who work on these issues. And so, in a sense, I take your question to be like, ought we not to occasionally just revisit the question of whether our technological innovation capacity cannot help us maybe deal with the underlying really deeply disturbing logic of mutually assured destruction as the underpinning of how we deal with the Russian nuclear capability, and to some extent, maybe even the Chinese. And I would note here, and this is my version maybe of Rose's answer, if I channel my inner Thomas Schelling and try to be a game theorist about this, I can imagine a world where a true technologically effective, anti-ballistic missile defense framework would drastically reduce the risk of nuclear annihilation if it were completely reliable and if we shared it with our adversaries at precisely the right moment, right? And I'm not foreclosing the possibility of discussion, but I find that scenario hard one to wrap my mind around.
So let me respond to that. And I don't rule it out. I think it's not in sight anytime soon. But so what's the way forward here? And my thinking at this point is, I agree with Rose. We ought to, in strategic stability discussions with the Russians, see if we can, and in similar discussions with the Chinese, see if we can put some limitations on these intermediate range systems, which are really the ones that are threatening our regional friends and allies. Let's see if we can do that. Point one. Point two, I think we should be willing to have a conversation with the Russians about ballistic missile defense. The problem in the past was that anytime you had a conversation with Russians about ballistic missile defense, their view was the United States should have no systems. And we'll keep our Moscow ABM system, but we just won't talk about it. Now, as Rose says, they're in the ballistic missile defense game big time, selling systems to countries who feel threatened by the ballistic missiles being deployed by their neighbors. That allows for a conversation that is different on missile defense. And we certainly should at least talk about transparency, confidence building measures, maybe limited cooperation on ballistic missile defense. We ought to be talking about that. There will be the question that George Perkovich put to us at the beginning. Would you accept limits on missile defense deployments? That's harder because there it raises the other question. Limits on our ballistic missile defense capability would constrain us not only for dealing with Russia, but also potentially dealing with China. We have to be concerned about ballistic missiles, both of Russia and China. Russia would tell you, I don't believe it, they're not concerned about Chinese ballistic missiles at all. Well, there is the new asymmetry in our strategic situations. So if you start thinking about limiting ballistic missile defenses, that gets, in terms of numbers, that's a problem. But thirdly, I would continue the kind of research and development and technological development to see whether we could get to the kind of outcome you're talking about. And we couldn't do that if we were still in the ABM Treaty.
That's very interesting. Let me put on the table a question from our audience, which is about whether the U.S. maybe has systematically overestimated, or how, what some would call the systematic U.S. overestimation of the rogue state threat should shape this discussion. And the questioner points out no Iraqi WMD, no Iranian ICBs, first North Korean ICBM test 17 years after the intelligence community predicted it. So, how should we think about that angle?
Tino, if I may, I'll come to that one in a second, but I wanted to quickly follow up on Steve's remarks with what I think is a pretty interesting vignette from recent Track 2 discussions with the Russians. And in this context, I'll take a shot at answering Judy and Paul Meyer's question, would there be merit in reviving the Theater Missile Defense Demarcation Agreement from the Clinton-Yeltsin years? My answer to that, Judy and Paul, is no. But I think it is worthwhile taking out and looking at very thoroughly the transparency measures that were agreed as part of those so-called New York protocols. because and there is a wealth of transparency and confidence building measures over time that have been developed, again, by both Republican and Democratic administrations. And we need to take them out and look at them, because when I've said to Russians, all right, we want your systems on the table in the next negotiations. If you want to limit US missile defenses, you need to put the S-500 on the table. And then they quickly say, well, then maybe let's not talk about limits. Let's talk about some confidence building and transparency measures instead. So I think it is a ripe moment for going back to the whole array developed across a number of administrations, including the New York protocols, and considering what is useful to put on the table now in terms of monitoring and transparency. You know, the other question is moot. I do understand, it's Greg Tillman's question. I do understand that, you know, of course, maybe we were overreacting at the time, but the fact is now there are very capable missile systems in the hands of the North Koreans, Iranians increasingly so, Iraqis, well, not so much, of course, but I have no question in my mind that regional missile proliferation is a very serious problem now, not only because of indigenous production and deployment, but also because these systems are falling into various hands, sometimes through sales, sometimes through donations. Just ask the Israelis about this problem. So I have no question that we are facing a serious theater and regional threat now, and from short range up to longer ranges.
We have a question from James Acton that asks us to consider how China's modernization of its nuclear capability appears in large part focused on ensuring its nuclear weapons can penetrate U.S. homeland defenses. And, you know, should the U.S. seek to address these concerns? And if so, how? Steve, maybe you can start.
I don't think that the Chinese nuclear expansion is driven by the desire to penetrate U.S. ballistic missile defenses. I think the projections are that they would have 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads by, I think, 2030. That estimate is up from about 400 of just a year ago. Why are they doing this? I think they're doing this because we have seen across the board a change in policy by Xi Jinping. China is asserting itself. It clearly believes it should be a dominant, if not the dominant power in the decades ahead, and having a strategic nuclear program comparable to that of the United States and Russia is, I think, part of that agenda. That's clearly where he's heading, and the capability they're developing could overwhelm any ballistic missile defense capabilities we have, and quite frankly, I think the Chinese and the Russians know that. So I think that it is being driven by other reasons. And of course, we're already in the business of deploying defenses to counter those missiles. As we talked about earlier, they have medium range and intermediate range missiles targeted against our friends and allies in Asia. And we are helping our friends and allies develop ballistic missile defense capabilities against those systems. The real question is, you know, we faced an existential challenge and threat in the Cold War from the Soviet strategic nuclear systems. With the end of the Cold War, we actually thought for a period of time that threat had gone away. Real question about whether that's the case, given where Russian policy is headed. Do we want to now be vulnerable in an existential way to another country as well, China? If not, what do we do about it? And that's a real question. And you have to decide whether ballistic missile defense of the homeland, in the same way we're providing ballistic missile defense to our friends and allies in the region, is ballistic missile defense of the homeland a piece of dealing with the China challenge, recognizing that for the foreseeable future, until the technology breakthroughs you're talking about come through, we're going to only have very limited capability. Is it something we should have? I think the jury's out. I think this is a new question, and it's one of the things that I'm sure you and Carnegie are going to take on, because a lot of hard thinking is required.
With the help of the two of you. Rose, your thoughts on this?
Oh, I really am in line very much now with what Steve has to say. I will always continue to place an emphasis. And frankly, I think that has to be our first priority now. We don't understand what China's objectives are with their nuclear modernization, with their digging up to 300 silos in the areas northwest of Beijing. They are continuing to modernize their forces in a way that seems like they are intent on developing a fully integrated triad of nuclear forces at the strategic level. And there is some indication, of course, that they are building up further warhead capability. So in that sense, we really need to focus. I think we need to keep our eye on the prize of finding out in the first instance what their objectives are. And that is one reason I was very glad that Biden and Xi evidently agreed that there would be an early attempt to sit down and have strategic stability talks between our two countries. I also think that the Russians should contribute here. I'm not arguing for trilateral strategic stability talks, but I think the Russians too should be asking the Chinese what their objectives are, and somehow we need to be communicating together among the three of us as we develop a further understanding. Interestingly enough, the P5 is preparing, as some of you know, the P5 process, they're preparing for the NPT review conference to start on the 4th of January. They had a meeting in Paris just last week where evidently they have talked about having a concerted and continued effort to develop mutual understanding of nuclear concepts and nuclear terminology. I think this is beneficial. I think that it's I think of it as a kind of stealth strategic stability dialogue among the P5. And I think that this should be encouraged, but we really need to understand what the Chinese are up to. At the same time, we should not be panicking about what we're up to and continue to remember that we have considerable force structure above and beyond what they will deploy even in the next 10 years.
We're unfortunately out of time. I know we could talk for another hour or so, but I just want to tell you why I'm so grateful to the two of you. I think of our defining challenge at Carnegie in part as asking the question, 20 years from now, if we're in a much better place with respect to the threat of nuclear annihilation, how did we get there? What steps did we have to take? What had to go right? Not only in Moscow and Beijing, but certainly in Washington. And I think this dialogue has advanced that kind of analysis very helpfully. I'm grateful to you for the work that you do and also for working with us. And I look forward to more of that in the future. Thank you both.
Thank you. It was a true pleasure.
Glad to be with you and glad to be with you, Rose.